Universal is continuing to grow their monsterverse in small and minuscule ways by way of Blumhouse. This latest installment, Wolfman, is directed by Leigh Whannell. It is written by Leigh Whannell and Corbett Tuck. And of course, it tells the story of the titular Wolfman. But much like The Invisible Man before it, it is a very small and self contained piece. I think I was very excited when they announced that they were going to take a different approach to the monster franchise that they owned. After the failure of the Dark Universe, Universal went, hey, what if we gave a lot of directors free reign to tell these small indie stories featuring these high concepts, be it Frankenstein or Wolfman or Dracula or the Invisible Man. After watching this Wolfman, I kind of miss the idea of a dark universe. Watching this movie made me crave something bigger. And I don't know if it's because it's been so many years of watching the same Blumhouse formula. So the Blumhouse production formula is a good one, right? You try and make impactful movies for as little money as possible. There are no budget extensions. If he gives you 10 million, 10 million is all you get. You make it work. And eventually, there are more box office successes than failures because of the small budget. These movies tend to recover their production costs. That said, a lot of the Blumhouse movies follow a very specific formula. And it's because they have to work with such a small budget. And so there's only so many things you can do without getting incredibly creative. The problem with Wolfman is that it feels far too templated and formulaic. You kind of know exactly how this movie is going to play out within the first 10 minutes, no jokes. And I'm not just saying this because Bahir and I have spent an entire lifetime watching movies. I think even if you haven't and you go into this, you know how it's going to play out. And that, for me, was the biggest problem. There were no surprises. It wasn't particularly clever. And for the most part, I was just glancing at my watch, wondering when it was going to end.
I think for me, the biggest surprise was that there was no surprise, that this was such a paint by numbers monster slash horror movie. And this is a monster slash horror movie. This isn't a slasher movie. There's nothing slasher about this. Even the horror, I would say, is very, very little.
It's not scary at all.
It's not scary at all. Yeah, there's a couple of jump scares that don't even amount to anything. It's the worst kind of paint by numbers. You know what? I was thinking about it. I was gonna say it almost feels lazy. It feels so basic, this thing.
I appreciate all of these indie takes on famous monster characters, right? But I think what I miss about the original Universal monsters or those stories was that, I don't know if this is the right word, but there was a certain amount of sexiness to it. I don't mean in a lustful way. I mean in a cool sexiness way. Whether it was the Brendan Fraser Mummy or even Bram Stoker's Dracula for that matter, there was always a sense that you were dealing with something epic.
Yeah.
This has scaled things down to such a level that it feels almost pedestrian. It's so small in scale that I think it loses some of the impact.
Yeah.
And that feels very potong steam. This one is essentially centered around three people.
Yeah.
This family man, good father character, takes his wife and daughter to Oregon because his father has been declared dead and he's got to clean out his house and farm and barn and all of that stuff, pack everything up and take it away in a truck. I don't know why. He could have just left it there and just sold the whole thing, right? But anyway, plot. So he had to do that. When he gets there, there's an unfortunate accident in the road, and they're suddenly being chased by this humanoid wolf-like creature. It's not a bear, it's standing up on 2 feet. And then he gets scratched, obviously, or bitten or something, and he begins to change. You know exactly how this is going to play out. You've seen it. There's one interesting thing that Leigh Whannell does in that he implements this visual style that kind of shows you the different perspectives of the humans and the Wolfman. And that's about 10 seconds worth of interesting in this entire movie.
Even that doesn't really get used to any real effect.
No.
It could have been cool if Leigh Whannell had used that as a descent into madness, or as a way to show that there's a distance growing between the father and his beloved daughter. Nope, it's just so you know what he sees.
Yeah.
Yeah, so for better or for worse, and I think we're both on the same page with regards that we think this is for the worse. This movie doesn't attempt to try anything with the idea of a werewolf in the mountains of Oregon in the US. There is no allusions to Native Americans. There is no attempt to tell a backstory about aliens. There is no trying to make this about a family curse. Nothing. It's just one guy who disappeared a long time ago and is now the progenitor, maybe, of this potential wolf people thing.
There is one throwaway reference to Native Americans in the opening scroll with regards to what this illness might be, and then nothing. It is a throwaway line in a title card, and that's it.
As I was watching this film, I liked the idea that they were taking their time with the setup, because everything that you said about how this guy goes back to the farm to deal with his father's belongings doesn't happen until halfway through the film.
Sure.
A lot of that first half, and I'm talking about 45 minutes of this movie, has got nothing to do with where it ends up. It is just setting up the relationship of our lead character when he was younger with his father, setting up his subsequent relationship with his own daughter in San Francisco, and setting up his relationship with his wife. They spent a long time setting up, and I was for it. I was like, oh, this is great. You're not just going to jump straight into it and throw blood on the screen, that you're gonna make us earn the horrors of the werewolf. Unfortunately, it didn't come through. A lot of this movie plays out at night. This movie happens over the course of one day, or rather over one night. A lot of that stuff happens in the darkness of an Oregon forest. Everything gets very black. Everything gets very muddy. That wasn't a great cinematic experience for me.
No. And you know what the other problem is with that? The other problem is sometimes when you do stuff like that, you want to hide the fact that you don't have much of a budget. And so maybe your werewolf effects are not great. This one, they show you the whole goddamn werewolf at one point, and it's still not great. I just thought the makeup felt uninspired.
Uninspired is a great word. Yes.
And that was my problem with it, because I think the Wolfman has such a rich mythology behind it. And even if you want to do something new or something different, at least lean into the existing mythology of the werewolf.
Yeah.
The poster shows you a fucking full moon.
Yeah.
Because they know that's what you think of when you think of a werewolf.
Yes.
But there is nothing about that in the actual movie, and that feels like such a cheat.
Yes.
Even with The Invisible Man, they leaned into that original storyline, but then twisted it for a kind of Me Too retelling, right?
Yeah.
Because it was still a scientist who becomes invisible, then turns out to be an abusive spouse, etc., etc. And so it told an interesting story while playing with the existing mythology. This one doesn't seem to give a shit about the mythology. It's done with it within the opening title cards.
Yeah.
And I felt that that was a cop-out and a missed opportunity. And so to not do that is one thing. And then to give us this really just... if you want to lean into body horror, then lean into body horror lah. But at least give me a wolfman or a werewolf that looks cool, that looks like a werewolf. Or even if you don't want to do the full hairy creature from the 1930s or 40s, do a Jack Nicholson wolf thing from 1994 where, suddenly he's got like really cool sideburns.
Yeah.
And, he's like slowly transforming in a cool and sexy way. Maybe that's one way of doing it.
Yeah.
But not this lah. This one just was like caught in an in-between situation that wasn't nice at all.
It just feels like they didn't decide what to do. They didn't make a call one way or the other. They couldn't decide if they wanted it to be more wolf animal like or more body horror. You know what I mean? Like they never really committed to the monster design being one way or the other.
Yeah.
And that was annoying. That was really frustrating for me.
The original Wolfman, or at least this remake version, was supposed to be Ryan Gosling.
I just read that.
Yeah. It was supposed to be Ryan Gosling and directed by Derek Cianfrance, who did Blue Valentine.
Right.
And the HBO Mark Ruffalo thing, I know this much is true.
Yeah.
And I think that would have been a very cool take. I don't know what that take would be, but given who Derek Cianfrance is, I think it would be pretty cool. This just feels like the paint by numbers version that they had to put out because they had committed to releasing these indie Universal monster movies.
I will be curious to see if that Ryan Gosling version is the same exact version, but with Ryan Gosling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I would be curious to see if that was the case. I feel like it can't be because there's no way Ryan Gosling will be in this Wolfman. It would not feel right.
Yeah, no.
I think this was fine. I think nobody would find this satisfying. I don't think anybody would come out of this movie feeling like they got their werewolf itch scratched.
Honestly, it feels like a really paint by numbers streaming affair.
Yeah.
This is a direct to streaming kind of movie.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what's most disappointing. I was just incredibly bored for most of it, and also because I was not surprised in any way. I kept hoping and wishing for something to happen. Or at least something to happen that I didn't see coming. The only thing I didn't see coming was that this movie ended 3 times. Every time I thought this movie ended, there was 10 minutes more. And it's not even a very long movie. It just felt incredibly long. And they just kept stretching out that ending to an incredibly predictable moment. On the one hand, we've seen so many movies that when a movie opens with the father and son standing out in the big outdoors overlooking a beautiful vista.
Yeah.
And the father says something about how, this view never gets old. In your brain, you're just screaming, foreshadowing! Like, it's coming back. Like, that is how obvious this film is. Like, everything is signposted in such, it's just,
it was frustrating.
Lazy
way.
It's lazy.
Yeah. Which is disappointing.
No, and you know what else? You know what else was really frustrating? The jump scares. In the sense that if you've watched enough horror movies, you know what the cues are for the jump scares.
Yeah.
And so in this one, early in the film, they're looking through a gun scope and you're like, oh, okay. It narrows your field of vision. You can't see anything. Your protagonist can't see anything. It's the perfect setup for a jump scare.
Yep.
The good directors and the good movies, and I'm not saying Leigh Whannell isn't a good director because he's made some pretty good horror movies in the past, but the good directors and the good movies subvert that expectation. And so because of that, I kept waiting for that subversion. And I kept looking outside of the frame for that subversion. But it didn't come. Instead, it just played out exactly the way you thought it would. There is the moment following on from that scene where they're up in a crow's nest. Yeah. And I thought he was alluding to something cool because the wolf creature climbs up and then you see his breath. Yeah. And I'm like, oh, this is a setup. This is going to be cool. And then nothing.
Never comes back.
It's just a wasted opportunity and just full of many, many multiple disappointments.
Yeah, which is strange because I won't say this would have been an easy win. Because on one hand, I agree with you with regards to the Blumhouse treatment of these horror films. But at the same time, I also like the Blumhouse treatment of these kinds of movies when they're done well. I feel like a movie like Wolfman, had it had a better story, I think would knock itself out of the park.
Yeah.
It's just that even without the expectations of $150 million, $200 million budget, this movie falls short.
I really want to go back and watch the Tom Cruise Mummy film.
Yeah.
I want to see if it's as bad as I remember, or whether at the time I was just comparing it to the Brendan Fraser movies. I need to rewatch that movie.
Yeah.
I think it fell down because it was a first movie that was trying too hard to set up a franchise.
Yeah.
But I'm curious to watch it again just to see if it's as bad as I remember. Anyway, Wolfman is incredibly disappointing. If you do happen to check it out, let us know what you think. You know how to reach out. We're on Instagram on GogglerMY. You can also email us on podcast@goggler.my or send us a WhatsApp on the Goggler hotline 012-524-5208. Thank you so much for listening. This is the Goggler Podcast.